3%. Therefore, it was inevitable that there was a gap between the number of votes on the National Election Commission server and the
컨퍼런스
actual
하는데
vote count of the
근처에서
counting
하는데요.
site.
저희가 집회 때문에 여기 중국 회사가 납해 온 게 아니라 컨퍼런스를 이 근처에서 한대요. 그래서 그분들 하는 데서 응원도 할 겸 6시에 거기 컨퍼런스 끝나거든요. 그럼 그분들이 합류하면 사람이 많아질 거고, 지금 홍보가 안 돼서 오늘은 많이 참여를 안 하셨는데 저는 미리 왔습니다. 와갖고 근데 오늘 5시부터 시작인데 늦은 줄 알고 허겁지겁 왔는데 이제 곧 나오실 거예요. 네. 아, 이거 지금 햇볕
Surprisingly, the numbers seem to decrease at various points during election day. Suddenly, the number of voters drops to 0, and sometimes the number of voters does not increase at all. After 37 minutes has passed at 4:44 p.m., the number of voters finally changes, but it doesn't increase. It decreases significantly from over 13 million votes casted to 4.7 million. And then another change. The numbers start going up again, increasing from 8.1 million to 13 million. And the fine-tuning of voter counts doesn't stop there, but continues even after the vote count closes. These drastic changes in the vote count suggest that the Election Commission's announcement is not the result of the votes actually being counted, but rather the result being fabricated by a computer program. Since the National Election Commission announces the number of votes fabricated by simulation, this accounts for the difference between the number of people the NEC says voted and the number of votes counted. In the early vote, the exact number of paper ballots distributed to the voters should be drawn and counted from the ballot box. However, in the recent 2024 general election, many constituencies had discrepancies between the distributed and the counted ballots. In some cases, not all distributed ballots were found in the ballot box, while in others, there were more ballots in the ballot box than had been distributed to the voters. A voter turnout of over 100% is clear evidence of rigging, as it was in many constituencies in the 2024 general election. At this point, Venezuela, where violent protests have recently erupted over alleged election fraud, comes to mind. The voter turnout there was also over 100%.
조금씩 더 나오고 계시네요.
The question now is, how did they actually implement the vote fraud? The simulated results are manipulated.
아, 저 하세빈님 또 유튜브에 나왔어요. 안녕하세요.
제가 보니까 호텔이 되게 중요한 순간이라 오히려 잘 된 거예요. 그래서 저는 그게 6시에 집중했잖아. 나오는 사람들 중에 딱 처음 보는 사람들 그냥
아까웠네.
말 걸고
이게 더 잘 나올래나?
내일 기자회견 할때 저희가 밥 먹는 시간에 밥 먹는 시간 시간 자유로 들어가 시간이 스케줄이 있더라고요.
주제는 되게 마음에 드는데 이게 지금 홍보가 사실 많이 안 돼갖고 그래서 사람이 아직 많이 안 모이신 거예요.
거기에 여러 군데 다큐멘터리를 가서 봐라. 내 집은 뭐야 이게? 여러 왜냐면은 여기서 전화번호가 나왔을 때 우회전을 좌회전
하려고 하고 침대를 하려고 그냥 얘기하고 집에 오시는 거 저거 상영회처럼 하고 사람들 나오기 시작하기 시작하세요.
저좀
출입구가 막혀가지고 하나밖에 없어.
그냥 호텔에 들어가면 전장문을 막아놨더라 공사 중에 내가 다 잊어버려.
근데 제가 봤을 때는 그 나와가지고 명품 전화가 우회전을 하지 좌회전을 하지 않고
그렇지.
저는 6시에 가가지고 나오는 사람들 일대일 만약에 여기에 가서 너무 낚시를 가나 아니면 우리 8시까지 있으니까 저런 것도 물어봐. 내지는 내가 너에게 바퀴를 리스트를 보내줄게. 그럼 가장 내일
아직 시작하려면 시간 좀 더 남았으니까요. 잠깐만 왔다리 갔다리 하면서 좀 찍을게요. 근데 이거 해킹이 부정선거 수법에 상당한 지분을 차지한다 그래야 되나? 더 이상은 못 갈 것 같고요. 어떻게 지분을 많이 차지하고 있냐면요. 방송사 투표율 있잖아요. 그거 투표율도 실시간으로 해킹되면서 그게 되게 들쭉날쭉 하거든요. 왜냐면은 여론조사랑 방송사 그 개표 결과 아니면 출구조사도 그거 개표 결과에 해당되는 거죠. 그런 게 다 같이 이제 맞물려 갖고 한 몸이 돼서 움직이는 거거든요. 근데 그렇게 되면은 먼저 지지율, 투표율, 개표율 다 조작해놓고 그거에 대한 투표지 증거는 나중에 쑤셔 넣는 거죠. 그래갖고 이게 이 부정수법이 해킹을 빼놓을 수가 없어요. 해킹은 그 실시간 인터넷 통신이 가능하게 하면은 뭐 와이파이를 쓸 수도 있고 블루투스를 쓸 수도 있고 아니면 다 들어보셨는지 모르겠는데 라이파이라는 것도 있거든요. 그거는 빛으로 통신을 하는 거예요. 그거는 이제 센서랑 마주쳐갖고 그 자율주행차에서 쓰이는 뭐 레이더가 아니라 라이다라고 있거든요. 그런 거를 쓰는 방식도 있는데, 그러니까 해킹을 하려면은 방법론으로는 수도 없이 많은데, 저도 옛날에 그런 거를 연구를 많이 해본 사람이라서 그 스파이들이 정보를 빼내기 위해서 자신의 정체성을 완전히 속이고 철저하게 이쪽 편인 것처럼 위장을 하죠. 그래서 되게 사람 성격 좋아 보이고, 아 오늘 여기 외국인 되게 많네. 설마 이거 하나 분수 하나 보려고 이렇게 많이 모였나? 왜 이렇게 많이 모인지 모르겠어요. 아 저거 애니메이션 보려고 모인 사람들이구나. 저거 이제 해치 같은 거, 그런 거 캐릭터. 뭐 관광객들은 그냥 별로 진지하게 오는 사람 없잖아요. 그래서 지금 미리 방송 틀어갖고 찍는 것도 답인데, 해킹을 모르면은 그 부정선거에 대해서 막는 거에 한계가 있다. 투표 용지로만 부정선거를 자행하는 게 아니라는 거. 왜냐면은 제가 아까 말씀드린 건데, 부정선거의 한 몸이 여론조사랑 지지율, 개표율, 투표율 이런 거랑 부정투표지랑 한 몸이 되려면은 다 맞춰야 되잖아요. 그리고 예전에는 전자개표기로만 조작을 했고, 시간이 더 지나면서 부정투표, 그러니까 사전 투표한 바꿔치기 막 이런 식으로 그런 걸로 조직을 했다가, 이제는 실시간 지지율 변경으로 더 큰 폭의 그 득표수 차이를 꾀할 수 있게 됐다. 이게 4.15 총선부터 중국 해커들이 민주당이랑 해서 재미를 많이 봤어요. 그러니까 그거를, 해킹의 흔적을 어디에 남는다? 전산 서버라고 다 들어보셨죠? 전산 서버에 해킹 흔적이 남기 때문에 그 서버에 있는 거를 다 이력을 말소시키면은 해킹이 있었다는 거를 입증이 안 되잖아요. 근데 저희가 그거를 한번 증거를 보존할 수가 있었거든요. 그러니까 옛날에 4.15 총선 2020년이죠. 그때 4.15 총선 때 뭐가 있었지? 그때 구리성관이라고 들어보신 분이 있을지 모르겠어요. 왜냐면은 전자개표기 증거가 모셔져 있던 데가 구리성관이에, 왜냐면은 선거 승복을 못한다고 문제를 제기를 하니까 구리성관이에 전자개표기가 다 모여있다 이런 정보가 다 누출이 돼갖고, 그래서 사람들이 그거 증거 확보하려고 다 구리성관이 밤새서 지키신 분들이 많거든요.
What is noteworthy about how we believe the Korean election fraud works is that a specific political party plans, a government agency implements.
전자개표기에 대한 증거 말고 서버에 남은 해킹 기록이라든지 서버 접속 기록에 주소가 만약에 중국 주소로 나온다든가 하면은 해킹을 당한 거겠죠. 근데 요새는 중국 주소를 우회해서 접속하는 우회 접속이 너무 쉬운 시대가 됐거든요. 근데 우회 접속 현장, 그러니까 주소가 만약에 대한민국으로 나왔어. 경찰이 거기를 갔는데 대한민국의 동네가 약간 현장이나 불일치하는 뭔가가 있으면은, 아, 이거 해킹당한 주소가 맞구나. 보이스 피싱을 할 때도요, 그 IP 접속 그거 바꾸거든요. 지역을 중국으로 하면은 보이스 피싱인지 경찰이 알고서 다 차단을 해줄 수가 있거든요. 그래서 그런 거를 속이기 위해서 우회 접속을 해야 되는데, 혹시라도 한국에서 이상한 장소가 IP로 잡히는데 그걸 또 아셔야 돼요. 그 선거 사무소 중에 비밀 사무소라고 있거든요. 거기서 한 게 뭐냐면은 가짜 투표지를 보관을 하고 있다가 바꿔치기 하는 장소. 그게 무슨 어디 체육관에 운동기구는 저기 멀찌감치 한 군데로 포개져 있고, 왜 그랬냐면 2020년대 코로나 때문에 그 핑계로 운동기구는 구석에 몰아넣을 수가 있었고. 아, 저 좀만 이따가 나올게요. 그래서 체육관에 무슨 삼리 빵 박스라고 그런 걸 들어보신 분이 있는지 모르겠어요. 그러니까 삼리 빵 박스 같이 그런 거를 체육관에, 그 체육관이요, 개표를 하는 동네 커다란 체육관이 아니라 그냥 그 헬스장 얘기하는 거예요. 그냥 조금 개인이 운영하는.
후보가 잘 안 돼가지고 사람이 없어도 할 거네 하죠?
네.
한세빈님이죠.
근데 방송을 타니까 적어도 하는 게 맞아요. 방송 타면 다 알려지고 내일도 있잖아요.
네네.
네.
일단 저희 사람이 없어도 할 건 해야 돼서 국민의례는 하고. 네. 국계단 경례하고 애국가 부르고
일단 나머지는 나중에 말씀드릴게요.
하고 이제 영상 틀도록 하겠습니다.
국민을에 먼저 할게요.
줄이러 가요. 예, 국회의원 대한 경례로 국민회를 시작하겠습니다. 앞에 있는 태극기를 보고 네, 국민회를 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
나는 자랑스러운 태극기야. 자유롭고 정의로운 대한민국의 무한 영광을 위해 충성을 다할 것을 굳게 하겠다.
바로 다음은 애국가 제청이 있을 거고요. 잠시만 기다려 주십시오. 1절만 부르도록 하겠습니다. 네, 다음은 순국 선열과 호흡 영양을 위한 묵념 시간 있도록 하겠습니다. 일동 묵념해 주시기 바랍니다.
한 조금 더 계속 늘어날 거예요.
오늘은 일단 전야제 느낌으로 왜 더 카르텔 영상 일단 상영을 할 거고요. 그리고 지금 또 나오시는 화이트해커 분들 있으면은 연설도 잠시 있을 것 같고요. 이거 계속 한번 보도록 하겠습니다. 이게 우리나라 부정선거 서버를 안 까고 있어요. 항상 선관위원장이 중앙선관위원장이 대법원장이고 각 선관위원장이 각 지방법원장이에요. 그러면 어떻게 되느냐, 선거에서 뭔가 구린 게 있으면은 자기가 판결을 내릴 수 있는 구조가 돼요. 그렇다 보니까 서버 검증이라든지 이런 부분에 대해서 우리나라에서는 계속 증거를 기각을 하고 있고, 그렇다 보니까 저희가 이제 이걸 우리의 힘으로 하기는 좀 힘들다라고 생각을 해서 좀 이번에 있는 공격형 화이트해커들 포럼 타이푼콘에 있는 해커들에게 좀 부탁하고 촉구하는 의미로 여기서 이렇게 오늘 전야제처럼 이렇게 집회를 할 거고 하고요. 내일 또 제대로 된 집회하고 상영을 하도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 이 영상 한글 버전으로 보고 싶은 분들은 왜 더 카르텔이라고 유튜브에 찾으면 나와요. 한번 보시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
너무 큰데? 소리가 너무 커갖고.
Since the 2020 general election, to date in Korea, there have been 10 public elections, including the 2020 general election, and we believe they have all been rigged. This documentary illustrates the struggle of ordinary citizens who are trying to shed light on this.
알아들으세요. 영어로만 나오고 있는데 한글이 안 나와서 알아들으실지
including the
모르겠어요.
United States, have suffered from allegations of election fraud. What is noteworthy about how we believe the Korean election fraud works is that a specific political party plans, a government agency implements, the Supreme Court covers up election frauds, and advanced information technology is used in these crimes. The following are the scenarios of election fraud that ordinary Korean people have uncovered on their own. The Democratic Party creates an election blueprint. From this blueprint, they run simulation software programmed on the National Election Commission server to inflate the vote count. The vote count is inflated through several methods, such as manipulating electronic counting machines, inserting fake ballots, or switching ballot boxes. The Supreme Court covers up these crimes by nullifying the recount. Of course, this hypothesis cannot be confirmed until the investigative agency forensically examines the National Election Commission servers and computer equipment. However, we believe it is the most persuasive hypothesis after analyzing the evidence collected thus far by citizens in the field. And over the next 30 minutes, we will lay out this evidence that supports our hypothesis. Many people were shocked by the results of the 2020 Korean general election, where the Democratic Party won by a large margin despite the even polls. Under Korean election laws, a voter can decide between casting their votes on election day or during the 2-day early vote period. Many citizens suspect that setting aside 2 days for early voting sets the stage for bad actors to perpetrate election fraud. The morning after the 2020 election, a Democratic Party staff member and political strategist posted this on his social media account. A table showing the number 163, which he bragged was the Democratic Party's prediction of the number of seats they would obtain, which later we found was the exact number of seats, along with an exact match in breakdown by constituency. And look at the table's title, Early Vote Manipulation Value. People began to wonder, could there be more to the 2020 general election results? Could it be, as this table suggests, that the early vote had been manipulated and served as a blueprint to the Democratic Party's plan to win the election? As social media users began to question the integrity of the post, it suddenly disappeared. Evidence that the Democratic Party may have planned the election in advance also emerged in the most recent 2024 elections. In an article in the Donga Ilbo, the Democratic Party said it was aiming for an overall voter turnout of 71.3%, including 31.3% in early voting. But even more surprising is that the early voter turnout in the 2024 general election was 31.3%, exactly the same as the Democratic Party's prediction. What political party sets a target election turnout to the exact decimal point? At this point, you may recall the 2020 general election blueprint with the exact prediction of all constituencies, which the Democratic Party strategist posted and deleted after controversy arose. How could the Democratic Party know the election results and voter turnout so accurately in advance? And what does the early vote manipulation value written in the Democratic Party's election blueprint mean? Our hypothesis about the early vote manipulation value is this. This manipulation value varies depending on the target number of constituency seats when the Democratic Party simulates the election results. For example, if the Democratic Party and the Conservative Party's constituency seats are set to 50-50, then the manipulation value is 1. The manipulation value for the 2020 general election was 1.71, targeting 163 seats.
저는 다 알아먹는데 다 영어라서 방송 나가시고 안 볼 것 같아서 겁나네. 근데 그냥요, 그러면 지금 영어라서 못 알아들으시는 분들은 제 방송 다 끝나고 번역 누르기가 있거든요. 자동 번역 눌러서 영어에서 한국어로 딱 자동 번역 누르면 알아들을 수 있게 자막이 달리거든요. 나중에 그렇게 해서 다시 보시는 것도 방법이에요.
The election simulation blueprint planned by the Democratic Party is implemented by the National Election Commission. And we believe the two are working hand in hand by using the system of early voting to inflate the vote count based on the Democratic Party's planned election blueprint. This creates fake vote numbers as there is not enough time to inflate the vote count on election day. These inflated fake votes create strange numbers that are statistically impossible. And the National Election Commission announced these fake vote numbers, claiming they were the election results.
In the election day vote should be close to the early vote. It is a general rule of statistics. But my statistical analysis of the vote result of the 2020 general election gave me strong confidence that this election is fraudulent.
That was Professor Ho Byung-ki, author of Secret Command, a statistical analysis of the 2020 election's vote manipulation. He looked at the data released by the National Election Commission and compared them to the 2016 election results. The horizontal line is the difference between the early vote versus election day votes. The vertical line represents the number of constituencies. If there are more early votes, the bar is to the right of 0. If there are more election day votes, the bar is to the left. In 2016, the votes were clustered around the center for both parties, meaning there was little difference between the number of early votes and election day votes, which come from real voters with no known manipulation. But in 2020, the blue bar representing the Democratic Party was entirely on the right side of 0, which means in every single constituency, they got more early votes than election day votes. The Red Conservative Party, the exact opposite. Not only that, the graph is a mirror image with a 10% shift of votes in either direction.
이게 뭐냐면요, 산을 표현한 화수.
Represented by the bars in the middle means their votes were not part of the manipulation.
원래 통계는요, 가운데로 뭉쳐 있어야 돼요. 저렇게 산계 대형으로 양쪽으로 산처럼 되면 안 돼요.
The result of the 2020 general election reported by the NEC is not possible in a real-life election.
Professor Huss said the likelihood of achieving a result like this, with tens of millions of real-life voters, is equivalent to tossing 253 coins in the air. and having them all turn up heads.
저기 서울 측정하는 데서 아예 안 들려가지고
This
조금 더
graph
걸어도
shows the
된다고.
national results of the 2024 general election. Red are the seats won by the Conservative Party, and blue are the seats won by the Democratic Party.
아니 서울 측정.
In many instances, the Conservative Party won in the election day vote. But as you can see in the early vote, the results were overturned in favor of the Democratic Party.
그 하세빈님이 모르겠어요.
It's especially apparent in the metropolitan area. Despite winning so many constituencies in the election day vote, the early vote results were overturned in favor of the Democratic Party in all constituencies, except one in Seochogu and 3 in Gangnam-gu. Had the early vote not been manipulated, this would have been virtually impossible to achieve. In the 2020 general election, many observers reported seeing the conservative candidate winning in the election day vote. But then the results reversed as early vote ballot boxes began to open late at night. You may remember the incident during the 2020 U.S. presidential election, when Donald Trump was winning in all the swing states until midnight. But when the mail-in ballot boxes that arrived early the next morning were opened, a flood of votes for Biden poured in, overturning the election results and giving Biden a victory. Immediately after the recent 2024 general election, the National Election Commission conducted a voter awareness survey, which asked the voters how they voted, either in the early vote or on election day. 38% of the voters responded that they chose to vote early. However, according to the 2024 NEC vote records, 47% were early votes, a difference of 9% between actual voters' responses and NEC vote records. That's about 4.26 million votes. Considering this survey was conducted by the National Election Commission, they must have an answer to the burning question on everyone's mind. What is the reason for this vast discrepancy? Many suspect that this 9% was inflated by the National Election Commission. Unlike election day votes, it's not required to keep printed registers, so anyone can go to a polling station and cast an early vote. Furthermore, the National Election Commission's voting manual has a clause that says, cover all CCTVs if installed in the voting locations, which makes it impossible to check the number of early voters or any other illegal activity, such as multiple voting or proxy voting around the voting locations. In other words, in case of early voting, the number of votes can be inflated at will. To inflate the number of early votes, simulation software programmed into the National Election Commission server is used. As for voting systems that cannot verify the actual number of voters, Elon Musk posted this. Mail-in and drop-box ballots should not be allowed, as cameras would at least prevent large-scale fraud by counting how many people showed up versus ballots cast. In the recently held 2024 general elections, more evidence of computer-rigged elections have emerged. The Democratic Party inadvertently told the press about the target voter turnout rate they had set in advance, which ended up being their downfall. In this election, the Democratic Party set the early vote turnout through simulation, but the election day vote turnout was lower than the target. So the actual voter turnout was only 67%, about 4% lower than the Democratic Party's target of 71.3%. Therefore, it was inevitable that there was a gap between the number of votes on the National Election Commission server and the actual vote count at the counting site. There are many cases reported where there is a difference between those two numbers. The simulation program adjusts the number of voters in real time on voting day according to the actual voter turnout. The following video shows the National Election Commission servers making such voter count adjustments in real time. On Election Day, April 10th, 2024, citizens who monitor the election are continuously scanning the number of voters announced by the National Election Commission on their website by time zone. Surprisingly, the numbers seem to decrease at various points during Election Day. Suddenly, the number of voters drops to zero, and sometimes the number of voters does not increase at all. After 37 minutes has passed at 4:44 p.m., the number of voters finally changes, but it doesn't increase. It decreases significantly from over 13 million votes casted to 4.7 million. And then another change. The numbers start going up again, increasing from 8.1 million to 13 million. And the fine-tuning of voter counts doesn't stop there, but continues even after the vote count closes. These drastic changes in the vote count suggest that the Election Commission's announcement is not the result of the votes actually being counted, but rather the result being fabricated by a computer program. Since the National Election Commission announces the number of votes fabricated by simulation, this accounts for the difference between the number of people the NEC says voted and the number of votes counted. In the early vote, the exact number of paper ballots distributed to the voters should be drawn and counted from the ballot box. However, in the recent 2024 general election, many constituencies had discrepancies between the distributed and the counted ballots. In some cases, not all distributed ballots were found in the ballot box, while in others, there were more ballots in the ballot box than had been distributed to the voters. A voter turnout of over 100% is clear evidence of rigging, as it was in many constituencies in the 2024 general election. At this point, Venezuela, where violent protests have recently erupted over alleged election fraud, comes to mind. The voter turnout there was also over 100%. The question now is, how did they actually implement the vote fraud? The simulated results are manipulated at the counting site using electronic counting machines. These are hundreds of ballots from one constituency going through a counting machine. Ordinarily, the ballots should appear in random order. But you can see that they are all marked for the Democratic Party candidate. You may recall from these over 100 consecutive Democratic vote scans, the so-called Biden spike, a strange phenomenon that occurred in Wisconsin and Michigan between 4 and 6 a.m. on November 4th, the day after the 2020 U.S. presidential election. When the vote counting, which had been halted around midnight, resumed, a sudden spike in Biden votes was observed. Of the over 100,000 votes counted at that time, more than 90% were for Biden, and similar phenomena that occurred in Korea and the US, which defy the basic laws of statistics, can only be explained by election fraud. We wondered if the ballots had been pre-sorted. But in the NEC's counting manual, there is a warning not to count already sorted ballots to avoid the possibility of inflating votes. In an interview with Jung-ang Ilbo in the 2020 general election, one of the major newspapers in Korea, the counting observers in the Buyo constituency told the reporter that they suspected that the electronic counting machines were fraudulently sorting ballots to benefit the Democratic Party. They said, when they demanded an explanation, The clerk responded by reluctantly rebooting the laptop connected to the electronic counting machine. Minutes later, they say the result flipped between the parties. Similar incidents also happened with other counting machines, and as a result, eventually flipped the winner in the Buyo constituency. According to the target votes inflated and manipulated by the Nisi computers, fake paper ballots were made and inserted into the ballot boxes. Take a look at this counting clerk separating paper ballots that are stuck together. Why are they stuck together when each ballot is cast separately? The NEC gives a nonsense explanation that the ballots stuck together by static electricity. And this, bundles of votes that look like they just came out from the mint. How is that possible for votes that go through many hands? And the NEC doesn't just stop at manipulating votes, it also controls the opinion polls, which is used to convince the public to accept fraudulent election results. This QR code contains identifying codes for each voter. When the ballot goes through the electronic counting machine, the voter's personal information, as well as who that person voted for, is input into the NEC's computer database. Now the NEC has access to this information, which is unconstitutional, and then supplies this information to opinion poll companies, leading to suspicions that the NEC has been interfering with public opinion polls. However, to date, there have been no investigations conducted into this allegation. Following the 2020 general election, the Supreme Court received 139 recount requests nationwide, but they only granted several. One, in the Incheon, Yeongsu constituency, filed by the one parliament member who challenged the vote results, Min Kyung-ok of the Conservative Party, who lost his seat. By law, recounts must take place within 6 months of the election. This recount took over a year.
Every time we opened the early ballot box, we found an unbelievable number of what appeared to be fake ballots in the box. When I saw this, I got goosebumps and couldn't believe my eyes.
These are the fake ballots that Attorney Yoon mentioned. And earlier, we showed you ballots that were so crisp and clean, they looked like they had just come from the mint. Those two were discovered in the recount evidence box. Listen to the explanation from the NEC's promotional video.
This ballot uses paper that is made of a special material that can bounce back to its original form without creases. Therefore, this cannot be an example of evidence that real ballots were replaced with fake ones.
If we are to believe what this video claims, then what about the other ballots in the box that remain creased? And then there's this, the voting clerk's seal, which should be clearly visible with a name and a place, smudged beyond recognition. More than half of the 1,900 ballots cast in a town in Incheon Yeongsu constituency were discovered this way. Voting clerks testified under oath that they had not stamped these ballots or even seen these ballots before. But the Supreme Court justices ignored this testimony. Listen to this printing expert with over 40 years of experience who participated in the Incheon Yeongsu constituency recount.
I approached the 3 Supreme Court justices and told them that the paper ballots in the recount were not the genuine ones cast by voters, but printed and cut in print shops. But Justice Cho Jae-yeon turned his head away and refused to listen.
There were also some truly bizarre incidents where ballots that were clearly present at the polling station and at the counting station did not show up in the recount. These ballots were clearly recorded in the voting book as having been cast by the voters. However, these ballots were not found in the recount. This is strong circumstantial evidence that the ballot boxes were replaced before the recount. In July 2022, Supreme Court Justices Chun Dae-ok, Cho Jae-yeon, and Yi Dong-won dismissed the recount lawsuit of Min Kyung-woo, justifying their decision in a Supreme Court opinion that the plaintiff named the National Election Commission as a defendant and, quote, couldn't pinpoint an actual offender or describe how the crime was perpetrated. They also wrote, quote, it is not a fraudulent election since no criminal would leave such obvious evidence. In addition, under the law, a Supreme Court justice must serve as the head of the National Election Commission. But if the National Election Commission is a defendant in a lawsuit, how is it constitutional for that judge to preside over a case in the Supreme Court? Many began to question the objectivity and motivations of the Supreme Court. It's easy to see with the naked eye that the paper ballots are fake. Verifying their validity is simple by examining them with a loupe or weighing them. But the Supreme Court justices wouldn't consider taking that extra step to cover up any allegations of wrongdoing.
The National Election Commission printed fake ballots matching the fabricated vote numbers and created new ballot boxes. Before the recount, they replaced the real paper ballots cast by voters with these prepared ballot boxes and discarded the real ballots by shredding or burning them. The Supreme Court justices all saw those fake ballots with their own eyes. Even though they knew what was going on, they made the conscious decision to cover it up.
The strongest evidence that the Supreme Court justices were covering up voter fraud is that they refused to open the ballot boxes for what is called the proportional representation vote. This is when voters pick their preferred party versus the candidate. Despite election laws that stipulate that recounts must happen within 180 days of a request, it took over 3 years to hold the recount trial for proportional representation votes. Even then, Supreme Court Justice Min Yoo-suk illegally dismissed the case without even opening the ballot boxes for a recount. The National Election Commission appears to have failed to precisely match the number of proportional representation ballots to the simulation before the recount. So if the ballot boxes had been opened and checked, there would have been a big discrepancy from the result announced by the NEC. In such cases, the fraud was so obvious that Justice Min Yoo-suk desperately tried to block the recount. In the general election of Korea, a voter receives 2 ballots voting for the constituency representation and also for the proportional representation. The proportional representation voting is to select the voter's preferred political party. Since the National Election Commission simulation program is designed to inflate early vote counts of constituency voting, proportional representation vote counts should match these numbers. In the 2024 general election, there were only 400,000 invalid votes in constituency voting, but 1.3 million invalid votes in proportional representation voting, more than 3 times that number. Due to time and technology constraints, the National Election Commission appears to have used mostly invalid ballots for proportional representation voting, while it used counterfeit ballots for constituency voting. The number of invalid votes for proportional representation in the 2024 general election reached a record high of 1.31 million. And many observers of the vote counting testified that they saw empty ballots that had not been marked for candidates thrown out in mass at the counting site. After the 2024 general election, the judiciary illegally denied all requests by candidates to preserve evidence for a recount. This means that there is no longer any legal post-election verification in this country. Other than a small number of those who are speaking out against the stolen election, most Koreans are staying silent, including the current president Yoon Suk-yeol, who took an oath of office to protect the country from constitutional violations. He is ignoring the people's demands to investigate election fraud crimes in 10 previous elections. All but one of them took place during his administration. Vote fraud is not just a crime. It's a matter of national security, particularly given recent North Korean aggressions under the strong protection and support of the Chinese Communist Party. And we believe that China played a role in the fraudulent 2020 elections. 9 months before the 2020 general election, the head of the Democratic Party's research think tank, Yang Zhongchol, paid a 4-day visit to China, where he met with high-ranking members of the Chinese Communist Party and flew to Shenzhen to visit the world-famous tech company, Tencent. And not only that, an accountant named Roy Kim discovered the Chinese Communist Party slogan, "Follow the Party," programmed and hidden in the ASCII code in the 2020 general election data announced by the NEC. He discovered the algorithm which the programmer used to plant these hidden codes in the NEC data. Also, numerous fake ballots were found in the count and recount, and those low-quality fake ballots are believed to have been hastily produced in third countries, such as China.
Canadians have been hearing and reading a lot about the issue of attempted foreign interference, particularly from China, in our elections.
It is well known that Chinese Communist Party has been interfering in other countries' recent elections, such as Canada. From these circumstances, people worry that Korea's national security and constitution are threatened by election fraud. As the president of a country under such threats, it is clear dereliction of duty in terms of national security not to order an investigation into vote fraud, which we discovered through multiple evidence. In fact, during his own presidential election, this video shows at dawn NEC employees opening the sealed mail and early vote ballot boxes and stuffing them with unidentified ballots. The NEC claims these are mail-in ballots, but the problem is that there is no way to verify the authenticity of these ballots. Tampering with sealed ballot boxes is illegal, and the seal should leave a trace when removed. Take a look at this video.
The NEC claims that the seal would leave marks when you remove it, but it does not. That doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous. My apologies. It should not be a matter of apology. See? That's absurd. Huh? No marks?
How come?
I will go and raise an objection.
Even the victim of the 2020 elections, the Conservative Party, is denying the existence of vote fraud, dismissing citizens' demands to investigate as conspiracy theories and going so far as to muzzle its own parliament members when they bring allegations of voter fraud. But many parliament members themselves are also choosing to keep their mouths shut, despite that Korea's democracy is on the brink of collapse due to election fraud. Many citizens believe that these politicians are staying quiet with the attitude of, "I got elected, so it doesn't matter." Or, "If I don't bow to the establishment, I ruin my chances for re-election." This kind of opportunistic attitude takes precedence over patriotism for the country or a sense of responsibility for the voters who voted for them. Listen to Han Dong-hoon, who was in charge of the recent 2024 general election campaign for the Conservative Party.
I personally do not believe in the conspiracy theory of vote fraud because there is no evidence of vote fraud in the 2020 general election.
Even the media is complicit. No major media reported any stories during the 2020 election recount, even as multiple instances of fraudulent ballots were discovered and evidence showed that the NEC and the Supreme Court justices were working together to cover this up. Only a few minor media agencies attempted to report on the subject. After the 2020 elections, a number of civic groups attempted to press charges against the NSC. But to date, there has been no investigation or indictments from police or prosecutors. Nearly everyone, from government officials to academia, seems to be avoiding the subject of voter fraud, despite the overwhelming evidence we laid out before you. Their silence shows that they are putting their own interests ahead of the vested interests of Korean society. famous words of Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. For the Korean people who have watched this video until now, to restore the collapsing constitutional democracy of our country, which will you choose? Silence or resistance?
왜 8시까지 할 거야?
일단 오늘 여기서 끝나고 그 해커분들이요 자신들 세미나 마치고 딴 데 어디 이동을 하셨대요. 그래서 방송은 오늘 여기까지만 찍겠습니다. 이거 안 내릴 테니까요, 궁금하면 다시 재생해서 보시면 되고, 번역하기가 오늘은 안 될 거고 한 내일 오전부터는 번역하기 기능이 지원될 거거든요. 그러면 자동 번역 눌러서 영어에서 한국어로 바꾸게 해서 그렇게 봐주시면 되겠습니다. 저 그거 때문에 지금 봐주시는 분 없어도 상관없었고요. 만약에 집회 있으면은 내일 나오든가 할게요. 네, 시청해주셔서 감사합니다.